All right, welcome everyone. Folks are coming in to the room. We are excited to have the kickoff to a 2-day conference hosted by the Religious Socialism uh, Working Group Initiative of Democratic Socialists of America. And this is the kickoff conversation entitled The Fire This Time, Forging a Multi-Faith Movement for Religious Socialism. Certainly in times like these, it's going to take every ounce of imagination, of organizing, of pulling together to confront not only the many manifestations of capital, but also of white supremacy, of patriarchy, of um, various kind of imperial logics that lead to so much wreckage and ruin in our communities. Um, with over 650 attendees, this is the largest gathering of folk who have a kind of religious or ethical commitment to socialism and DSA's history. And given the explicit nature of this, perhaps it's also notable in terms of a wider sense of folk doing this kind of convening generally. For those who may be new to some of the work that DSA is doing, just a quick uh, background and explain I'll do there. And also want to encourage folks to just introduce yourselves to one another in the chat. When I was at Hampton University, we would do things like rep your city, say your name, where you're from, where you're at. Y'all get acquainted. I know we've been in these boxes for a while during the pandemic, so get as comfortable as you can with one another. Appreciate you, Matt, getting us going in the chat. Um, so for those who may be newer to DSA, or this is one of your first times, the core belief is that working folks should govern the economy and society in a democratic way, deep involvement in the decision making in order to meet human needs, not to make profits and hoard resources for a few. So DSA is a political and activist organization that, while it intervenes in politics heavily, is not a party. The goal is to build a kind of density of working class power so that we can shift political economy towards workers from all communities on every issue. Glad to see the energy moving in the chat. Y'all keep it up. I see folks are coming in. Uh, and let me introduce this august and distinguished group of panelists that we have, as well as myself. Reverend Andrew Wilkes come to this conversation as a longtime proud part of Religious Socialism's editorial group, also a pastor, writer, and policy director. And I'm going to start off by introducing Reverend Jazmine Brooks, who comes to this conversation with so many wonderful hats. The pastor of Macedonia AME Church down in Virginia, an educator, vice president of the Staunton branch of the NAACP. She's also served as an organizer and leader with Washington, D.C.'s Poor People's Campaign, program director of the Office of Inclusive Excellence over at Mary Baldwin University. And her work and leadership have been profiled in USA Today. So we're grateful to have Reverend Jazmine with us for this conversation. Also want to introduce Samy Amkieh. Did I say that right? Samy, I want to make sure I pronounced that correctly.
Yeah, it's Amkieh.
Samy Amkieh. Thank you so much for that correction. Sam is the co-founder of the DSA Muslim Caucus, an undergraduate student leader and organizer at Brown, co-chair of the Providence Defund the Police Working Group, member of Brown's Muslim Student Association and the Al Kareem Mosque in Providence, and also worked as a COVID-19 case investigator with the Rhode Island Health Department, and is an alum of Senator Sanders' presidential campaign in 2020. And then our last panelist is Dr. Xavier Pickett, who is an assistant professor of Religious Studies and Africana Studies at North Carolina State University. Prior to that, he was a visiting assistant professor at New York University. Um, his research focuses on African American religion, politics, emotions, social movements like Black Power, Black Lives Matter. And his current book project reconceptualizes the academic study of Black religion by shifting attention to the affect, to literature, and to the secular. He's also a dear friend, going back to our time in grad school together. And I hope he will permit me the personal remark, was a groomsman in my wedding. So appreciate you in so many ways. What's unique about this is we're having a kind of millennial and Gen Z group of panelists about what is really our shared kind of intergenerational work, because building a multi-faith movement for socialism is certainly going to take us working across geographies and across generations. So let's hop into the conversation. Would encourage folks as we do to direct your questions to the Q&A box. It's much easier to see your questions through that particular channel, that particular portal, rather than the chat where it may be a little tougher to differentiate and to pull out what's taking place. So let's hop into the first question, which I want to direct to all of our panelists. This conversation is entitled "The Fire Next Time," which is a kind of double allusion to James Baldwin's iconic work from 1973, "The Fire Next Time," but also Jazmine Ward's edited collection on the theme, which is much closer to the title, the Fire This Time. And so I'm wondering, what might it mean for religious traditions to recognize or cultivate a kind of fire and passion and commitment within efforts to undo white supremacy and to shift our political economy beyond capitalism? I'm going to go to you, Reverend Jazmine, first to kind of open us up.
I think a part of the challenge with religiosity is that it operates in modes of exclusivity. Like if you live into these 5 pillars, you will be blessed. If you abstain from these particular activities, you'll make it to heaven. You're either born in or blessed in, but there's a criterion for both, right? It's actually not that much different from white supremacy, nor the ways that our political economy operates. And I think it contributes to, or it shows up in the ways we flinch to defend certain persons executed by the state before we've had an opportunity to do like a behavioral analysis on the victim. So like, what were they doing? What were they saying? How were they moving? Did they have a weapon? All of those types of questions. And I'll speak particularly from my own Christian lens that for so many, the very basis of our faith is that we were born sinners who needed to be saved by the suffering of an innocent lamb. We couldn't be saved by Barabbas or either man next to Jesus on Calvary, but by the one who we perceive to have never made a misstep. And this is the understanding of ourselves through which we navigate white supremacy in our political economy. This is what informs the way that we move about the world, that we endure suffering in hopes that we will gain a seat next to Jesus in the afterlife, because suffering is our payment for being sin-filled human beings, or that those who experience persecution are either wretches who need to be saved by personal sanctification, or they are innocents who have suffered for God's sake or justice sake or truth's sake. But Baldwin said this one thing in an interview that I often repeat, and I think this gets to kind of the answer to your question. And he says, "Aren't we all children of God?" And so for religious traditions to recognize or cultivate the fire that matters, we have to begin by seeing every human being as worthy of life and access to the fullness thereof, and then to do the work that is reflective of such a truth. So partnering with grassroots organizations who already have the skills, as opposed to assuming that we must be the leaders, participating in mutual aid networks, and distinguishing ourselves as religious entities apart from the work of the state. I think we too often align ourselves with political political pundits as opposed to distinguishing ourselves from the state. And so if our religious institutions were distinctly different from white supremacy in the current operations of our political economy, we could have already been able to witness the undoing and the shifting. And so we must start with, so this is where we must start with cultivating that fire.
Powerful. And I'm hearing the tension between you referencing Baldwin, aren't we all children of God? A deep kind of egalitarian emphasis on our humanity over against what can be religious modes of exclusivity. Samy, I want to bring you in and would love to hear your thoughts on the same.
Yeah, I think from an explicitly Muslim perspective, like the emphasis from birth to grave is really about standing out firmly for justice. There's a quote in the Quran, the Muslim holy book. It goes, "O you who believe, stand out firmly for justice as witnesses of God, even if against yourselves or your parents or your kin, and whether it be against rich or poor, for God can best protect both. Follow not the lusts of your hearts, lest you swerve. And if you distort justice or decline to do justice, verily God is well acquainted with all that you do." So I think the guiding thing for me when I hear this question is like people that are in, DSA Muslims, for example, people who do have some fire in their hearts and are trying to, bring about justice in the world, like their basis is their faith. So I think, like just turning to faith and actually understanding what our faith tells us to do and calls upon us to do, that's honestly the best way to cultivate fire within our efforts. And specifically for Muslims, we don't do enough of tying the explicitly anti-Black racist tradition of Islam with the reality, which is not an Islam that is devoid of anti-Black racism and all forms of discrimination. So I think that's part of it, and we know that that's pivotal because in the last sermon of the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "You are all from Adam, and Adam is from dust. There is no virtue for an Arab over a non-Arab, nor for a non-Arab over an Arab, nor for a white person over a Black person, nor for a Black person over a white person, except by righteousness." So I think there's a lot of gravity given to the last words of the prophet, as there is a lot of gravity given to the words of all the prophets across faith traditions. And this, amongst the last words, was a call to respect like the dignity and sanctity of all lives, and that you will be judged not on any distinguishing factor, but on your righteousness and what you do in the world. So I think that's, in terms of cultivating the fire, like that should be the basis for, anti-racist and anti-poverty agendas in our communities, but specifically within mosques, people don't talk about the prevalence of poverty and don't talk about the prevalence of police brutality and state surveillance. So, going off of what the Reverend said, there is this, interplay between the state and the religious institutions. But as far as Muslims have felt, it's going back to the founding of America and the first Muslims who were Black and who were brought as slaves by use of force. It has always remained the case that Muslims have faced the backlash of the state when it came to state-based racism and systemic racism, and enforcing poverty and surveillance on our communities. So it's like you just gotta peel back these onions. You gotta understand the history, and that really is fire like none can see. It's so motivating to look back and see how Muslims in America have been at the heart of a lot of these struggles against white supremacy and against poverty politics. So sorry, I'll stop there.
No, I appreciate you sharing that and calling us to peel back the onions and the layers, and certainly you're doing that work with defund the police and in other ways. Maybe you wrote a really great piece on the tradition of Malcolm X in many ways, and how Malcolm is revered across religious and ethical traditions for having done that kind of work, among others. Dr. Pickett, would love to bring you into this conversation to round us out as well.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to be amongst this sort of august panel and panelists, and really topic. So I want to think about it, kind of riff off of the former sort of reflections by coming at it this way. One, by really at least sort of questioning the assumption that maybe we all might be working with, or many of us, that is that fire being cultivated in certain individuals and groups, organizations, is actually good, right? And so I think while
play
fire
with the premise a little bit.
Yeah. So I think while fire is neutral, the fire wielding is not, right? And so because the fire that has been thoroughly cultivated, particularly the last 4 years, but we can think about the last 10 years, 11, 12, and depending on how we want to periodize, we can push it back even further. I mean, so much of the fire that's been cultivated in this country has been by white Christians, white evangelical Christians. And so, and that fire is thoroughly sort of, saturated and sort of sustained by sort of white supremacy. But we know white supremacy is also really white Christian supremacy in many ways in this country, right? So that Christianity is so much a part of, white Christianity is so much a part of actually what constitute is predicated upon sort of white supremacy, right? It's saturated through and through. And so what does it mean when certain folks get angry over here and other folks get angry over there, and so, and how those forms of anger not only are cultivated in particular ways, but also are sustained and racialized in particular ways too. And so, and there's actually the ways in which they get racialized by certain groups, by sort of, white evangelical groups, actually that particular form of anger, fire, rage, whatever you want to call it, is actually is destructive, right? So how I want to kind of approach it, this particular question, is actually there are certain kinds of fires actually that are destructive, and there's other kinds of fires that might be more purifying. And I know Christians who are familiar with sort of the Bible can appreciate that sort of imagery, right, and language, right? So there's a refiner's kind of fire, and I think that's in some ways the types of fire that Black people have been wielding in this country that oftentimes actually get considered is actually demonized, actually castigated, actually is read already as destructive before it's actually even enacted. And so whereas the fire and the anger by white folks, so that actually is valorized, right, is actually, lauded. And we see in some significant way that's precisely what happened in January the 6th, right? That type of display of anger, that type of fire, right? Is by certain groups, is a heroic act, right? And so it's something that to even memorialize and to celebrate. So whereas when other rage bearers, who are darker, right, and who tend to sort of the treatment that they get for their fire, right, we already know how the disproportionate sort of state violence, is how it's enacted there. And so that is a way of really saying that we actually all the more reason to cultivate a particular fire of Black folks in this country, right? Because without that particular fire that Black people have had, right, for so long, actually did not cause the country to be destroyed, right? And so it's actually the very thing that actually might be holding it together. Because if Black folks were really to enact the full force, and depths of the fire, right, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now over Zoom, right? So it would be a civil war every day. So, but let me, I'll end my remarks there because I want to get myself into too much trouble. So
no, trouble is a good thing, or perhaps to your point, trouble is a multi-dimensional thing. There's a kind of trouble that may be destructive, corrosive, and trouble that can be powerful. Want to make sure we're thinking this conversation across traditions. We talked about fire in an opaque kind of way that can push toward liberation, push towards a kind of socialist economic democracy, but it can also push in another direction. I also think of radical Dharma and Buddhist texts on the path of liberation through anger. And so that there's Thich Nhat Hanh, right, calling us to peace in every step. So it's a way that we can narrate fire's multiple valences across religious traditions. No one has a monopoly on it. And yet when we dive deeply into the embers and the logs of what gives us a sense of identity and purpose and collectivity in the world, we can find some of that fire. Appreciating the rich conversation and see folks are still going to chat. We'll have a Q&A period. We'll make sure to save ample space for that. If you have that question, you don't just want to put it on a Post-it note, invite you to throw it in the Q&A box, and I'll do my best to kind of work it in as we're having this conversation. So let's keep the conversation unfolding and unfurling. We're already in a moment where the fight for 15 an hour, and I want to be clear, which is itself already far too low in many regions, metropolitan areas. Nevertheless, 15 an hour at that point hasn't gotten a hearing in the Senate where the PRO Act, which would make it easier to have things like sectoral bargaining and to increase union density in the country, which can help push on things like wages and benefits and against the misclassification of workers and a number of other things, which, while not necessarily in and of itself pushing us inherently an act of economic democracy, can help facilitate conditions that make organizing towards that end easier. But that is also stalled in the Senate. And just lifting up a couple of national examples, because folks are tuning in from different jurisdictions and places across the country, maybe even different countries. So given this national backdrop, as well as different regional realities from where various folks are coming into this conversation, I'm wondering if each of you might be able to speak briefly but powerfully to this question of what concrete contributions can religious traditions make within wider socialist movements. We already have a little precedent for playing with the premise, so take the question where you want. All I ask is that you come. I came up in a tradition that said you don't have to be long to be strong, and because I want to hear from all of you. What specific value adds can religious communities bring the wider socialist movement? This time, Sam, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll wrap around.
Yeah, I think the really important role is that we form bridges between, whether it's the church, the mosque, the synagogue, etc., the community spaces, and the movement. And I mean this quite literally, because we saw people like the Reverend William Barber during the Fight for 15 fight. He was like one of the only people in politics period, not in religious circles, but in politics period writ large, who was actually willing to say, well, it wasn't just the Republicans were being bad and this, that, like there's, failure all around to be attributed to all these players in this game. And it's something that was not tolerable. And he called out people relying on these, flimsy excuses for not actually doing the things that are needed. So I definitely reference people to that speech in terms of how you can sort of, how religious traditions can make concrete contributions to wider movements, but also wider socialist movements. And I think what is explicitly needed, because, even in Muslim spaces, there was a lot of discussion over the summer around Black Lives Matter, anti-Black racism in mosques and in community. And there was this sort of like aversion to going into how political systems work, but like we need to identify like capitalism, which was the driving force that brought about all these pieces, all these elements of systemic racism. That is not a compatible, socioeconomic framework with Islam. It's not. It values profit over people, and that's not compatible. And Islam is not equivalent to socialism, but surely socialism is adjacent to Islam and is actually compatible with how we can conduct ourselves, in terms of interactions between people and how we take care of each other. So I think that explicit connection was not made as much as it needed to be. I'll just end with one simple hadith, and these are sort of just sayings of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam that are sort of collected for people's just knowledge and understanding. But one hadith.
Teach the people, Sammy. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, one hadith, and I don't have the explicit hadith in front of me. I forgot to get the exact quote. But the hadith itself talks about how if there is a single person, and it didn't specify Muslim, if there's a single person in your community and within a certain radius of your house, and they go to sleep without food and they're hungry, you have a right, there's a communal obligation, similar to communal prayers. There's communal obligations, same category, to feed that person, to take care of that person. So these are sort of echoes of not a capitalist, venture and let's solve, poverty, whatever, through consulting. This is an exact, copy of what it means to socialize the good and to make sure that nobody goes without food, nobody goes without a living wage, so they can actually afford a home, food on their table, and a dignified existence. So I think those explicit connections need to be made, because they were made by the people who brought about, these faith traditions. They were made long ago. We just have forgotten them. And I think, to echo off of what Dr. Xavier said, like, yeah, we see the perversion of this fire. We see the fire of like evangelical Christians, going all in on, defending a state like Israel, for example, and calling for a very anti-Semitic and hatred-driven ideology, in terms of, well, we want the rapture to come about in the end of times, which would literally mean, the burning of Jewry in Israel. So I mean, that's, there's this sort of perversion of fire and faith. So I guess wanting to like bring us back to the true path, Sirat al-Mustaqim, like that's the idea, that's the goal, and that's how we make a wider socialist movement. I think bringing in all those people that already have it in their hearts and have been hearing the preaching this entire time, but have not made those explicit connections.
Yeah, I really appreciate your point about there being a kind of something that can be commended to people, even if you're not necessarily a part of that particular tradition. When you were talking about one of the sayings of the prophet, you talked about how there's a sense of subjectivity and personhood that applies, even if one is not necessarily Islamic, if one's not necessarily Christian, Buddhist, Jainist, and so forth. There is a kind of a wider sense of belonging that springs from, right, perhaps our particular nodes of nourishment and belonging. But the circle extends beyond that. Powerful point. Want to bring in Dr. Pickett and then Reverend Jazmine coming to you on this.
Yeah.
And again, the question is just to kind of reset the room, as they say in space. What specific kind of contributions can religious movements make to wider socialist currents?
Yeah, I think this is such a really good question to ask, and how I want to think about the question is by sort of acknowledging and not really taking for granted how difficult it is to sustain a social movement in general, right? And so like we might be sort of, some of us might be under the illusion that because we've seen, Black Lives Matter, or the movement for Black Lives, all these different sort of descriptions of a particular movement within the last sort of, 8 to 9 years, depending on how you want to periodize it, that, and Occupy, before that. And so we might be tempted to sort of believe that like, oh, okay, well, we just live in a world where social movements, exist, and they kind of running concurrently with all of our regular sort of daily sort of processes, operations, like institutions, that they just are always around. And really the reality is that they are not. And so these social movements are actually very fragile, things, they're can oftentimes be very fragmented as well. And a lot of that fragility and fragmentation, is in some ways created by just external pressures, and namely, to be a little bit more specific, is like, state repression. And so, and various forms of state repression, whether it's through arrest, beating, sort of like disappearance. And we know a lot of people who have been a part of and are a part of movements have disappeared, for instance, or getting all kinds of, experiencing all kinds of violence by the state. And on the other hand, there's like, inside of the movement themselves are experiencing a number of sort of like fissures and just fragmentations of various sorts, right? And that actually hinders the movement from internal, right? In a way that is not just, movements just do not collapse because of simply external forces and pressures. And so I said all that to say this actually heightens the context and the need for religious people and religious organizations of various sorts to actually to be involved in social movements in particular in some very important ways, and largely because partly one of the reasons why movements sort of dissipate, and we don't really think about this, even social movement theorists themselves don't really, there's not a whole lot of research actually on this, is for one reason. Let's just take the most obvious reason that everyone is familiar with, like burnout, for instance, right? This is one of the major things that kill movements, right? So in addition to like the kind of fragmentation, kind of the fractionalization, that kind of stuff, but also like kind of just the, just people might lose their fire, right? Just coming back to that particular thing. Yep. Religious organizations are the particular sorts of things, institutions, groups, and people who actually can provide the types of like non-material values that so many movements need, which is to say, movements just don't need just to be financed. They actually need non-material value. That is, like, you might need hope. Where are you going to get your hope from? Are you going to get it from, some corporation? Or are you going to get, where are you going to draw your hope from? That's a non-material good. Where are you going to draw your sort of like your joy, your love? Like, where are you going to get all that stuff from? So religious organizations and institutions are really prime, and people are really prime because they have, that's not to say exclusively, but they sort of primarily traffic in, part of what their identity is as an institution is to provide and to sort of to offer and reflect these particular non-material values and goods that actually sustain us, not just in terms of movement work, but sustain us in our daily, everyday lives as individuals, right? What are you gonna do? We all have experienced today when it's hard to get up in the morning, right? So what is it that gets you up, right? It's not just gonna be a cause, right? Something that you're just fighting for out in the world. It's got to be something deeper to keep you to going when it seems like that cause is lost. But I'll end there, and we can maybe circle back.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. A part of one of the distinctive, but to your point, which is well taken, not necessarily exclusive contributions religious communities can make, is providing this sense of hope, this sense of joy. I'd also add a capacity to hold irony and paradox, because so often there's disappointment in building movements of any kind, particularly in social movements, which so easily get commodified, and you get yellow paint and Black Lives Matter signs, and the one here in Brooklyn and in many other cities has just been kind of cleaned up, and now it's just black asphalt, and a minimalist corporate commitment to even signifying racial justice and economic justice is literally being washed away. The press releases are coming down, and it's barely been a year. So that's a powerful point, to not slip into thoroughgoing skepticism that has us turn religion into an enclave of the self. We need to be talking about the beneficent kinds of fire. Reverend Jazmine, hop in here. What kinds of contributions might religious communities make to socialist movements?
I want to start by just acknowledging and affirming what Dr. Pickett spoke to in terms of how unsustainable so many of our movements can be. And a large part of that is because that is the nature of white supremacy and capitalism, to capitalize not only on your money, but your energy and your time. So we saw over the summer last year where, all of these movements are popping up all over the place. And then very quickly, oh no, the world is opening back up. You all need to go back to work. We cannot protest if we're at work. we cannot give fully of ourselves to the movement and to the work if we are working from 9 a.m. in the morning to 5 p.m. in the evening. And for many Americans are working more than one job. And so that burnout is the natural order. Well, let me rephrase, it's not the natural order of things, but it's the curated design of white supremacy and capitalism to keep us busy, to keep us tired, to make us so that we don't have the fire that's necessary to fight. And so I affirm too what Dr. Pickett said about the necessity of religious institutions to preach a fire, to inspire hope, to inspire people to keep moving when it seems that all is lost. But I also will push back against this, this idea that religious institutions are not don't need to just dwell on the material contributions, because for me, that's always going to be the starting place. You're talking about a working class people and poor people who are largely the leaders and on the front lines of these movements. They need money. And religious institutions have a lot of money and a lot of manpower. And so that's always going to be at the top of my list for a widespread contribution for religious institutions. You're looking, like if you look on Twitter and social media, a lot of the money to fund these movements and these organizations is crowdfunded. It's a whole bunch of poor people passing around the same dollars. And so money is one way that we can make a contribution, particularly because I'm learning that many of our religious institutions do not have the range to lead the movement, do not have the range to lead political education, but they do have the tools to support. And I know that most of the people who are listening here do have the range and are doing the work. And you're talking about 500 people who registered for this conference and 100 people who are, listening in right now. But what percentage of actual religious institutions in America is that? There's so many people who do not have access to these spaces, but there are organizations, grassroots organizations who are on the ground doing this work that we can support. So religious institutions, for me, collectively have the manpower and the money power. So when you have working class folk like those in Georgia who are up against a billionaire, there's space for us to provide funds for lawyers. And many, and particularly in the Black church, Black Christian church, we have lawyers. And so how do we donate our gifts and our expertise, and how do we donate our funds for childcare and just general support? So when they're out of work, they don't have to worry about how they're going to pay the rent. When they're out protesting, they don't have to worry about how their children will eat or where their children will go when they get out of school if I'm still down at the courthouse. All of those types of things are the reason why it's so necessary to me for religious institutions to donate money and manpower.
Powerful. I want to do some recapping for folks who are just joining or have been with us for a while. We've heard in terms of some of the particular contributions that can be given, everything from a kind of skill sharing and offering your expertise. If one is a lawyer, right? If one's a physician, an accountant, one can kind of gift in ways that acknowledge boundaries, right? To movement work, to building a kind of decommodified consensual space where folks can get what they need and bring their creativity. We've got hope and other kind of non-material values, even as we're pushing on the material and offering things like money. Oftentimes faith communities have spaces, right? Like physical spaces that can be used to do COVID testing, to do political education, to offer sanctuary for undocumented folks, as well as a space for those who are striking and may need nourishment. So there's multiple kinds of contributions. Want to again encourage folks to wade on into the proverbial waters of the Q&A box. The box is being neglected, and I suspect there may be some points of curiosity, maybe some pushback, all of which is welcome. So I want to invite you to offer that so we can have this conversation be as multilateral as possible. And we're going to, in just a few moments, make a turn in earnest towards the Q&A section. So I want to get this question on the table. This time I'm going to start with you, Dr. Pickett, and then we'll wrap around. Because we've been kind of hinting at the fact that religious fire is not necessarily a good thing. And I want to deal with it in this way, not only in a kind of Manichaean good and bad sense, but sometimes religious fire can kind of bring folks into a public square. And it could be that one's vision of the good may be more of a kind of flickering frame, which, while helpful, if one is envisioning, for instance, a kind of what Tamara Lomax calls a kind of aspirational Black capitalism or aspirational capitalism for communities of color. If we, want to buy up the block and presume that bringing together a few banks and corporate social philanthropy will lead to emancipation from much larger flows of capital and extraction, we might have a problem, even though folks have tapped into a kind of fire. And so I'd say that as kind of a segue into the question of this sort. We might posit that religious communities of all traditions have practices of domination, of extraction to confront. And so I'm wondering, as that internal work of dealing with what we might call strange kinds of fire, where's there overlap between faith traditions doing that inside job and the Venn diagram of external work of trying to build a more humane and democratic economy? Dr. Pickett, hop in here, and then we'll wrap around.
Yeah, I'm trying to make sure I get the question right. So the Venn diagram on both sides, and where's it?
Yeah, happy to restate if that's helpful.
Yeah.
If we suppose that faith communities of all sorts are not just coming in as angels into this work, but have histories and heritages which they need to interrogate, how can that work of interrogation and refining happen alongside pushing for a more humane political economy?
Yeah, okay. So part of what I guess I take and I hear in a question, and correct me if I'm wrong, is how might sort of faith communities, religious communities of various sorts sort of acknowledge like their own sort of unfaithfulness, while at the very same time trying to call the country and its other institutions and civic leaders and elected officials to something higher, and hold them and not just inspire them to be faithful, even while they are unfaithful, but also holding them accountable to what they had promised and to do, and what they sort of place their faith in us, at least with their purported sort of like public statements, the way they've said, well, having faith in their constituents to right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think it probably would be quite, it will, to say that it would be fascinating for a religious, let's just say, institution of a particular sort, what is the denomination or like a group of institutions that's being sort of led by some overarching frame. It will be, I think, quite powerful for whatever that kind of institution or group of religious leaders actually to, I mean, this is a tricky thing I'm about to say, and I haven't really tested this out in public, so I don't know if I want to go too far with it. But I mean, I think if one wants to call the country, to use some kind of Christian theological parlance for a second, not just Christian, but language of repentance, to want to call someone else to repentance, a particular sort of like nation state to repentance, without actually sort of reckoning with the ways in which one should also like be repentant. I mean, I think something like that could be quite powerful. I also can see how that can actually add fire, no pun intended, but in some ways pun intended, to sort of like the opponents, right? It use the very thing that you sort of like, the ways in which one sort of articulate and share their shortcomings, which is a way of being vulnerable. I mean, it's hard to be vulnerable, right? Even when vulnerability is the very thing that oftentimes is so needed to be able to push beyond ourselves. And I'm not saying this at the individual level, but at the institutional level, like as part of why there's so much lack of trust, and this is why movements fail. And this is, and this is the other part of that, is because there's so much distrust that is not just internal to movement, but there's so much distrust of the very sort of like people who say they're like, supporters of the movement, right? Mm-hmm. Which in some cases are religious leaders and communities and institutions. And so because so many movement activists, right, know how many times religious institutions and leaders have failed them, were cowards, right, who closed their doors, who actually didn't open up the space that Andrew was just referencing, right? And so like we need a place just to lay our head for tonight. We're being sort of like, chased out of town and around the neighborhood by all kinds of like form of law enforcement. So that's kind of how I want to get it started. Hopefully we can double back to some of this. And so this is a really, really good question.
Yeah, and I see, I want to acknowledge that the Q&A box has in fact been popping and populating. It's that I must have inadvertently overlooked it. So rest assured, there's no invisibilizing here. We're going to get to your questions momentarily. Samy, I'm going to go to you, then to Reverend Jazmine. Then we'll turn in earnest to these questions. The Saints are throwing them in there now. We're ready to go. Samy?
Yeah, I think a really good example comes to mind when I think about this question. So a lot of mosques, and I'm sure, and I know for a fact, this has happened at churches, synagogues, temples, etc. when they're sort of approached with these sort of really fundamental questions, for example, last summer with the Black Lives Matter protests, you know, I've heard things from religious leaders, from community members themselves, the attitude of, well, you know, they're fighting for something good and that's just, but, you know, elements of their movement are insert thing that is not compatible with Islam or whatever. You know, they'll take one piece of the movement, or they'll take somebody in the movement and they'll invalidate the entire cause, which is a cause for justice and that is aligned with, you know, with the faith, right? So I think that's the internal, whether it's decolonization or truly, like, you know, acknowledgement and processing of oftentimes really capitalistic mentalities, and addressing them with the need for you know, the faith to actually be present when we're building power to make police alternatives, in this one example, because they've been largely absent. I think that's part of the thing that we need to fight against. And I 1000% agree. I neglected to make that connection, but I think it was really powerful when the Reverend talked about, like, faith organizations using their resources, their money, their community power. That would have been great in Providence when we had police doing awful, terrible things, predominantly to Black and brown folks that lived in those communities. So it was, you know, it would have been, you know, a really concrete step forward to have sanctuary mosques, sanctuary religious houses, to have the legal defense funds that were used for protesters who were being brutalized and charged with all kinds of ridiculous things, to have access to a legal defense fund that was funded not just by you know, protesters themselves and community, but also by the faith institutions. So I think you see some of this stuff happening in communities that have long faced these injustices for decades and decades and decades, but we don't see enough of it. And I think one explicit thing that I will mention, because it has echoes from whether it's you know, people collaborating with police and religious institutions and with you know, carceral forces, even when they know their community is being jailed at a disproportionately higher rate. But one thing that we see a lot recently in the Muslim community is that, especially in lower income, predominantly Black and brown mosques, we see the proliferation of religious leaders and religious institutions working with, taking money from, and aiding in the surveillance of their own congregation. And the CVE, the Countering Violent Extremism program, was the pinnacle example of this. But it's not new in America. And these have been, you know, capitalist interventions since the time of the founding of America till now, that have been designed to work with religious institutions to undermine their own congregation. And the worst example, the most egregious example of how this gets weaponized, when these religious institutions participate in these programs, instead of, this is sort of the opposite. This is the overlapping link in the opposite direction. But when they participate, I mean, we had in Boston, the CVE program there would identify young Somali boys as potential terrorist threats, and one of the qualifying criteria was that if they spent too much time alone in a room, that was a qualifying criteria to end you up on a watch list, which meant you were getting surveilled, which meant you had a higher chance of risking arrest and being put in jail. So I think, like, you know, it's really just about, like, being extremely critical of every single piece of what our faith communities are doing and pushing them in the right direction. Because, you know, in Rhode Island, for example, I'm working really hard to try to bring in our mosques when it comes to this defund the police work, because they represent heavily Black and brown communities that are being over policed, that have high rates of mass incarceration, even in their own congregation. And we're trying to bring them into work around Medicare for all, because we have a statewide campaign and we need their help. And their congregations don't have healthcare, and they've had huge issues just dealing with COVID, as one example. But, you know, I think that you know, if we do the work as socialists of opening people's eyes, stating the case, because these faith communities are open spaces where we can talk to folks. There's no restriction there. So if we do the work of making sure people understand what their money is going to, whether it's in the mosque, you know, bucket, what that money is actually doing, that's how we kind of radicalize our institutions to actually do the work that they were supposed to do, if they actually are true to the faith, right? So I think that's the key, and we see it in some, I think, Black congregational churches across the South. We've seen a lot of this historically, and we're starting to see it more across the country.
Yeah, powerful, powerful, and thank you for sharing in such a detailed and also encompassing way. Reverend Jasmine, once you get the last word here, um, and we're turning to the Q&A after that. And I'm just so folks know who are continuing to share your questions, I'm trying to classify them because there's several themes that are emerging. So I want to make sure we can address them together when possible, so we can hit everything being raised. I think you might be on mute now.
Yep, thanks. If you don't mind, can we just repeat the question for the people and for me?
Absolutely. Happy to repeat the question. So the question on the table here is, um, we might posit that religious communities of all traditions, so often have their own practices of domination and extraction to confront. So how can that work of self confrontation, accountability, etc., happen while building a more kind of socialist political economy?
So I think the answer that I answered for question number one, I hit a little bit of the answer to this as well, because I think it requires a shift in theology. What do you believe about who God is and how God is at work in the world? What do you believe about yourself and how God exists in relationship with all of creation? Because essentially we operate in modes of exclusivity. And so the further we move away from elitist theologies and capitalist modes of operation that determine success by how many bodies are in the seat, what's your membership, and how much money you raise in a year, then we can begin to do the work of building a more humane society when the value is not placed on how many people you can gather and how much money you can raise, because essentially that's a capitalist mode of operation. And so, as you said earlier, Andrew, this applies to interfaith traditions, radical Dharma, Buddhist traditions. And I'm thinking particularly about how some of our religions began as opposition to the state, namely Islam and the Jesus movement, which Samy also spoke to a bit as well. What might it look like for us to center ourselves around those origins by aligning ourselves with the most vulnerable? The working class, what fight are they fighting already, and how can we follow their lead and support that fight? Those who are unlettered and unhoused, how can we advocate for those neighbors and ensure their safety in a way that exposes those who have curated their deprivation? Aligning ourselves with those whose only power is in the collective. Right? This is all they have to offer is themselves, and unabashedly doing so at the expense of the power structure. That means supporting the policy proposals of organizers who are already doing the work as opposed to campaigning for political pundits. There are too many churches and religious organizations who are throwing their weight behind representatives. And I think we should just totally divest.
My.
No more interest in representatives in the seats of power when we can just abolish the seat of power altogether, right? And so that we can give the power back to the collective, donating funds and showing up physically for calls to action, showing up for the exploited workers of Amazon. It is lending our spaces to protest and to freedom schools so that the masses have access to political education. There's so many steps that we can be taking, but I hope that those are just, a couple of the shorthand steps. Let's quickly unravel this theology of elitism so that we can get to doing the work that aligns us with those who are the most vulnerable, and showing up for them in a very real way. At the same time, unwedding ourselves from the state and the power structure.
All right, all right. The chat was going off as you were sharing, Reverend Jasmine. And so this is a wonderful segue into the conversation. So there's a number of broad themes to get on the table. And y'all charge it to my head, not my heart. If my synthesis isn't what it could be and what I hope it is. The first one on the table, and it was raised by George, I believe, is there was an earlier theme in the conversation. We were talking about how capitalism often stretches us from 9 to 5. In many cases, folks are working more than one job in order to meet basic needs. And so one of the questions on the table is, what might be the role of centers of production, of labor, of whether that's worker centers, labor unions, what have you, and pushing for a more socialist and cooperative arrangement of the economy. Would love to bring that question um, to you, Reverend Jazmine, then Dr. Pickett, would love for you to hop in here as well.
Okay, I'm so sorry that I might need you to make the question a little bit more succinct for me just one more time. I promise just one more time.
Absolutely. We can work on it together. So one pathway towards getting to socialism is, after you clock out of work, you do your movement work. A complementary way potentially is at work agitating and coalescing folks so that the distribution of wages, of benefits, and whatever else an organization may have itself is more democratic. And so how do we get to that kind of second place where work itself is less hierarchical, less exploitative, and so on?
I think this goes to what I've kind of been getting at, is that religious institutions have to first rid themselves of this hierarchical structure. Like, how many of us give so many of our after work hours to the church as volunteers? That also is an exploitation of labor. And so we have to be mindful of the ways that we participate in these systems, so that when we are organizing the people to push back against the ways that it shows up in I guess, secular society, there's really not a distinction between the secular and the sacred in my tradition, but, for the sake of understanding, just, when we're pushing back, it doesn't look hypocritical, or it isn't hypocritical. And so we use our spaces to organize the folk around particular policies, and we're already to some degree serving as okay, now I'm losing my words. What do you call those people who lobbyists? Like, we're already to some degree serving as lobbyists. And so how do we lobby around policies that are most beneficial to our working class citizens? And how do we support working class citizens so that, they can take these hours off of work? How do we connect them to our networks? Because a lot of us have networks, but we keep them, we're very insular about them. So I hope that gets to the answer of your question. I'm not quite sure if I touched the answer to your question, but I hope that I did.
No, I think it absolutely does. And I'm actually going to put a separate question to you, Dr. Pickett, and one to you, Samy, so that we can cover more ground. One question that is on the table is, when we talk about religious sorts of socialisms, however conceived, are we talking about creating a counter narrative? Is this a rediscovery of, the work of Nanny Helen Burroughs doing cooperatives in DC, or, George Washington Woodbay, or, Maroon communities, perhaps? Are we retrieving? Are we re-narrating? Is it something else? What are we talking about here?
I can go first, or Samy. Okay, so yeah, I mean, they very well could be, a retrieving, kind of reclaiming, and for some there might be a rediscovery, So, and I think what matters, it seems to me, is not so much how you get there, but that you get there, right? That you find actually sort of like if what it means to sort of get to certain kinds of like socialist like ideals that one might be interested in or interested in exploring, if your religious tradition, have sort of like intersections, that, then I think that's great. And so I think for me, I think, and maybe maybe it might be the question I may need to sort of think about it in a different way or with different language. But while I think it's important to recognize and to have sort of ways to identify ourselves, whether it's some kind of religious sort of language, or Christian, or Muslim, or in political language, or I'm a Democrat, or I'm a socialist. Like, I think what matters is trying to identify what are the overlapping sort of like interests that seemingly different groups might not actually have, but if we were to be in communication in some kind of way, that we find out that we do have. And the fact that we happen to, situate ourselves in different ways and identify with different groups, I think, it's easier to sort of overcome those kinds of, I hate to sort of, use the sort of language of, isms, because all isms are not necessarily bad, but I do think it could lead to various forms of tribalism. And that's where we sort of like, you know, the types of discourse and connections and communication that we need to have with each other, you know, fall. And then we inadvertently sometimes end up becoming disconnected from our very own traditions, the very sources that we actually take so much inspiration from, the, you know, the various sources, you know, that we tend to sort of want to even aspire to. And so I think whether we find, you know, socialist sorts of commitments and visions, and we take those things to be aspiring, and if we happen to find those things in our religious tradition, all the more better. If we don't, that's okay too. The question is like, the question is the types of things to which we're aspiring to, like whether we find them in our religious or political tradition, we got to find them. Now, of course, we got to fight about, we might want to disagree about what those things are that we want to sort of aspire to and how we want to arrange ourselves politically and socially. But, you know, I think, you know, at a sort of a high level, I think, you know, at least it's whatever group we find ourselves in, that we're finding ways to communicate about the things that we're most deeply committed to, the things that we deeply care about, right? And how to then materialize those things in the world, especially if those types of things that will benefit more than just ourselves individually. Because there's a lot of things that we can care about in the individual level, and even in our own in groups, that actually comes at the expense of out groups, right? Those people who are not a part of who we take to be in our community. So, so I don't want to just draw a one-to-one sort of like correlation or assumption that the things that we care about also must be good for other people, because that's not always the case. And this is what public policy in general has been in this country, particularly the last 20 years. It's been in the interest of white people, right? And so, and it comes at the disinterest of Black folks. And so Ronald Walters, very important Black political scientist, wrote about this 2 years ago. I mean, about 20 some years ago, talking about the rise of white nationalism and how that actually have thwarted, you know, and undermined the sort of like interests of Black people of various sorts across various sort of like demographics. And so, but anyway.
No, I think you're making an important point. And Samy, coming to you with the question here, a part of the under-discussed history of socialism, particularly in a US context, is that there's so often been anti-social currents of socialism. And so when you think of someone like a David Harvey, a Marxist who was recently in an interview celebrating the New Deal as an example of central planning and essentially a kind of socialist way of organizing resources. I'm not accusing Harvey of intentionally making this move, but inadvertently, when we lift up the New Deal and the FDR era as our North Star for approximating socialism, and don't talk about how the political costs and coalitions of getting to the New Deal were excluding Black folk in agricultural spaces, working in domestic spaces, from labor protections, from the benefit of being able to collectively self-represent their interests, then we miss how certain kinds of white articulated politics undermine the very kind of common good that I think we so deeply and desperately want to build together. Samy, want to bring you in on this question and theme, which has been emerging in many ways throughout the conversation. One of the questions I think plays out a bit here. It's the question of not only where might religious communities make contributions to wider socialist movements, but where might there be a kind of invitation or challenge to kind of engage in the world a bit differently? Where might there, does that make sense? Happy to rephrase the question.
Yeah, I think I'm getting at it. Can you rephrase it or try to rephrase it or repeat it one more time?
Yeah, so the question on the table here is what sorts of, I want to frame it in the way that I think the question is put on the table. The panelists have put really powerful things on the table in terms of contributions made to socialist movements that might be not necessarily dissonant in nature, but when it comes to a challenging point. So for instance, one might say that a certain kind of religious pacifism, for instance, might push back strenuously in abolishing not only police departments and prisons and detention centers, but also 800 military bases across the world in a way that's not exclusive to religious people, but there's a distinct tradition of peacekeeping, which is not always accented in the same way among spaces that don't necessarily come from religious context. So wondering if you can speak a bit to that question, or push back against the premise of that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to see, because I went to most people don't know this about me, but I went to a Jesuit Catholic school for high school in New Orleans. But I was raised as Muslim. There aren't many Muslim. There are more now, but there are not that many Muslim schools, or frankly good public schools in Louisiana. But and that's a whole separate conversation. But like the interesting part to me was even in this sort of like where, and I saw the question in the Q&A box, sort of what what challenges do religious traditions pose to the left? And I think in a lot of cases, and I say this because it's true, but in a lot of cases, the religious institutions in the U.S. pose challenges to the left that are like, they're not grounded in justice oftentimes. So being raised in a Muslim faith but going to the Catholic school, I was constantly like, okay, well, all this the scriptural text and all this stuff is great, but like the reality of living in a rather conservative state, it butted against what was being preached. The practice did not match what was being preached. So maybe there are sort of inclinations or writings or practices that don't fully align with abolition, as one example. But I think it's really on us to investigate, like, okay, where are these inclinations coming from? Oftentimes, and I think that the protection one, the sort of the guardian, the stewardship role, where the stewards of the world or whatever, the guardians of the world, the protectors, the police. That's tied explicitly to imperial and colonialist ventures. We were viewed as like the guardian angels, and it was explicitly religious in the Philippines. And we have a lot of Philippine nurses who, Christianity was used in the Philippines as a way to, I don't remember the exact phraseology used by some of these people, but there's quotes about like the pacifying or the civilizing effect of Christianity, right? So I think that we've got to be careful in how we don't decolonize our religion and the history of a lot of our religions, because in America specifically, religion oftentimes and it continues to be used in explicitly imperial and colonial ventures. And I mentioned this earlier, but Palestine's a great example of that. There are a million examples of that. Even now, as they, there's a question of whether we should leave, Afghanistan after 20 years of destroying that society. We see liberals try to justify our continued presence there on humanistic and sometimes religious grounds of, well, we need to protect women's rights. It's like you've been killing people left and right, and now you're worried about women's rights. It's just, there's a lot of so I think that's the part we need to be wary of, and I think it ties directly to that hyper politicization of the religious figures in a way that is not helpful or not productive. It's the preachers who will go and give a prayer, with Joe Biden, and it's like, do you not recognize the history and the legacy of racism and exploitation that man and that system represents? You can't. That's not compatible with the true faith traditions that we seek to kind of align ourselves with. So I think that's the really key part. And
let me hop in there, if you don't mind. Just really appreciate that point, and just hopping in only because of the time dynamic. Want to make sure that each of you can share just kind of a few words just to kind of close this out. Maybe a minute or so I'd ask from each panelist, just to make sure we can wrap around. Thank everyone for being a part of this kickoff to a 2-day conference. There will be other conversations on faith and building labor movements, on pushing Medicare for all, on how to do the work of religious socialism in a polycentric way. Certainly, while DSA is doing important work. There are tons of organizations that have been doing this work as well. And so building multiple nodes of connective tissue so that we can do this work on a collaborative basis is a part of, and in a way that streams and is sourced from our faith traditions, is a powerful way to proceed. For those who may be curious and want perhaps a civic altar call of sorts, if you're looking for one space among others to do your organizing work, would certainly invite you to become a member of DSA, and you can do that by going to DSA. USA.org, I believe, or religioussocialism.org. So definitely want you to know that the invitation is extended in that sense. And so I'm going to turn to each of our panelists. Thank you so much, Lawrence, for dropping that in the chat. We're going to wrap this up by like 1:12. Reverend Jazmine, I'm going to go to you, then Dr. Pickett, then you, Samy. Thank you all so much for joining. Hope you all can hang around for some of the following sessions. The floor is yours, Reverend Jazmine.
Sorry, I keep forgetting to come off mute. So you want me to name some of the ways for folk to get connected?
Absolutely. However you want to flow in your closing remarks.
Okay, just closing. So for starters, I saw in the Q&A that someone pushed back against one of the comments I made, and I am always a proponent of making sure that voices are heard. And so I just want to acknowledge this comment, which was essentially a disagreement with the idea that volunteering is exploitation of labor. And theologically, I would agree with that. I think that it is okay for us to volunteer at our religious institutions. And so I don't want to let us leave this space believing that the good Reverend Jazmine said, if you're volunteering, you're being exploited. And if you are a church that has volunteers, you are exploiting or exploitative. But I do want us to be mindful of the ways that we reflect the society that we are pushing back against, just to be mindful of it. And doing that and having volunteers or hosting volunteers in a way that is ethical, because what we don't want to do is maximize people's time and labor without compensating them, particularly when we live in a nation with the poverty rates that we have and the rates of poverty exploitation and labor exploitation that we have. And so I just want to put that in the atmosphere before we leave the space. I also want to encourage folks, because I know that this is an organization that is all across the spectrum. I live in a small town called Stanton, Virginia, and I know that everybody is from different places. I encourage you to look for organizations that are nearby where you live. You can start by just showing up to your city council meeting and hearing what they're talking about. Look around the room and see where those voices of dissent are and connect with those folk. Because they are likely a part of organizations, grassroots organizations in your area. And so I won't necessarily name organizations because I'm not sure where everyone is located, but I hope that you will show up to those places of government and those places of work that are taking place in your area and find those voices of dissent that you can connect with so that you can begin doing the work alongside those folk.
Powerful. Pickett, going to you.
Yeah. So I'm in North Carolina and I'm new to North Carolina, but I've gotten connected with some people who are interested in running for office locally. I'm in the Triangle, specifically Raleigh-Durham. And so one, I just want to invite people who maybe we have people from the North Carolina area, so to reach out to me because we're looking to try to flip North Carolina, and so we're trying to organize folks in the rural areas, getting people access to vaccines and all these sorts of things. And so one, just an invitation to, you can look me up on my NC State website, with my email address there. One thing I would say just lastly, overall, just that one, socialist, movements and organizations, while the conversation could sort of lead us to believe that, is sort of unilateral. How can religious institutions and traditions, contribute to socialist efforts? I also want to suggest that actually social efforts can contribute to religious organizations and movements and so forth. So there are, significant, particularly when there's significant overlapping interests, and And I think one would be surprised to find that there is a lot of overlapping interests. And so, having said that, lastly, I would say, we are our own heroes, right? And so I say that because like we're living a moment where we're so still even now looking for like elected officials, celebrities to lead, right, to rally around. And so and the work is in our hands. And so like we are the leaders that we've been looking for, kind of thing. And so I hope that we will sort of embrace that, and not just sort of settle for representational politics, right? Just settle for the representation, settle for the symbol, right? Yeah. And we give away the substance that lies with us to be able to push for the types of change that we want in the world.
Powerful. Sam, I'm going to let you close this out with the last word. Again, thank you so much, Reverend Jazmine, Dr. Pickett. Thank you, Sammy. I'm thanking you in advance because Sammy, you're going to have the last word.
Yeah, and I think just kind of going off that in terms of us being the leaders that we want to, that we've been sort of craving. If you're interested in starting or exploring starting a whether it's a defund the police campaign, Medicare for all campaign, whatever it is, local, feel free to reach out. I'll drop my email in the chat. I'm happy to chat with anyone about what that looks like, what it might entail, and sort of lessons learned, especially when it comes to connecting with community members, finding those dissenters, and actually doing something useful and powerful. And I think for me, a lot of this started when I heard the story of there was this Sudanese cab driver in Las Vegas at the Nevada caucuses. So an explicitly political setting. But he was just like, yeah, I'm voting for Bernie because, and then he went on to describe all the things he was struggling with in his life and how everything was rigged against him, and what he saw in the policy proposals being put forward, not in any adoration or worship of the man, or the ego. And it ended up that one person swayed basically the entire room, and that caucus site went for Bernie. And so I don't bring this to be like, oh, I certainly have a lot of disappointment in Bernie since he dropped out, but I think I bring it up to say that especially when it comes to the religious and the intersections with the political, I think we got to constantly strive to be very morally consistent and explicit. And that if we fail to do so, we're just going to fall into the same traps of whether it's identity politics, whether it's corrupt representation, whatever. The people that we hope to like elevate in our communities and uplift, they will not be uplifted. So I think that's the kind of like parting words is that like Dr. Xavier and I think also the Reverend have pointed out, like we can't keep falling for the same stuff. We got to kind of create our own ecosphere and atmosphere and our own sources of power and leadership. And I think this is it's a great start. So if you're interested, I'll drop they have the DSA join link. But if you're a Muslim and you're interested in joining the National Muslim Caucus, feel free. The DSA National Muslim Caucus. There's a different one that goes by the same name. But if you're interested in joining, there's the link right there.
Thank you so much, Sammy. Thank you so much. All panelists for an incredible contribution, conversation. I'm gonna ask, I hope you don't mind, Reverend Jazmine, you don't mind putting your Twitter handle so the Saints can follow you there as well. What a blessing in a multifaceted way. Hold on to your fire, hold on to each other, and hold on to what we can do together when we build a world untethered to white supremacy and capitalist political economy. We will head on now to the next conversation, and I hope to connect with some of y'all offline and online. Take care, everyone.